I just want to go back into this thing to do with swerving and falling. But I want to see if I can pull in some of the ideas that you're talking about, Gary, to do with suffering and meaning and gravity. Because that was a lovely title, that. Suffering is the gravity of meaning. And I think that's... I know you're not... I think you just feel self-conscious about associating yourself with poetry, but a lot of the things you say have got a very kind of brutal poetry to them, and sometimes quite a lyrical poetry to them. And that sentence, I think, is a really great one, about suffering being the gravity of meaning. So I want to see if I can deploy that poetic understanding in my thinking to do with this Lucretius and Democritus stuff. Let me just rehearse that one more time. Lucretius and Democritus, Greek philosophers 2,500 years ago, came up with this idea, the early atomists, that the universe is a series of atoms falling. And the history of the universe is the falling of atoms, all falling in parallel lines, but at some point these atoms acquire the capacity to do the Klineman thing, which is to swerve from their downward path. And in that swerving they begin to collide with one another, interact, shatter into fragments, combine, form little swirls and twirls and spirals around one another, and eventually that becomes the world and the universe. It doesn't feel like we're falling because we're all falling at exactly the same rate, just like cars on the motorway. You look at the other cars, no one looks like they're moving, but you're all falling towards the future together. And it's that kind of an impulse. So that's this Klineman swerve falling thing. But I want to just see if I can pull in this suffering and meaning thing too, because I think there's quite a lot of rightness about that. Because in a way, on a more kind of lived sense, just in terms of human experience and the history of human and animal and multicellular, single cellular life, I wouldn't call that experience, but that's been, in a sense, that has been a kind of falling. In the most literal sense, sometimes, we've been falling out of uteruses as humans and as mammals for millions of years. Millions of years have seen us fall into the world, a world that preceded our arrival, and falling into it, and then straddling the grave and something else falling out of us. And this constant descent has been going on for millions of years. And before we were falling out of uteruses, we were falling away from our cell partners. We were falling away from our parent cells and out into the world. In fact, in the early days, when we were just single-celled organisms, very, very early cells, that's all we did. We just fell in straight parallel lines. No Klineman, no curves, no means of avoidance, no means of attraction, repulsion. Just the falling, just cells falling, like precipitating into a solution. For millions of years, prior to the bifurcation into the animals and whatever the other one that came off that. It's just falling. But at some point during that fall, probably around the time of the development of sensory motor systems, I think, at some point during that fall, our single-celled ancestors acquired some kind of propensity to fall away from their atomistic falling companions. Like skydivers, you fall, but if you're falling long enough, you might just develop the propensity to do a certain thing with your body which takes you away from your falling partners. And I think it would be away from, because falling is a dangerous business. You wouldn't want to fall too close to someone, even as a cell. So you would develop the propensity to fall away from and maintain the distance. And then I think you would want to isn't the right word, is it? You would develop the capacity to gain some control over that. What might be an accidental falling and tumbling would be rewarded through evolution, of course, through the evolution of the fall. Through you'd develop eventually a capacity to gain some control over that, and the necessity to gain some control over that. Falling towards would probably feel like something. Falling away would probably feel like something. And you would gain the capacity to gain control of the falling away. Because falling towards will hurt. Falling towards will hurt. Gravity will kill you, just like it does with old folk now. Most people die from falling over That's the way the decay cycle works. And that suffering being the if you can call it suffering, the suffering of those atoms, just or the cells at least, the atoms of being, the falling away from, the need to fall away from the suffering is the clinamen, I think, which puts the whole thing into action. You know, the central nervous system allows the single-celled animals, the amoeba-like single-celled animals, to develop the propensity to put out the pseudopodia and not just fall towards another falling entity, but enclose that falling entity and take it into itself. So it becomes a kind of eukaryotic entity joined together, one entity inside the other falling together. And then they develop the propensity to fall away from one another again. So two eukaryotic cells fall in parallel and tumble and put out the pseudopodia and react to negative stimuli and have a little bit of something that in future generations we'll call suffering. They can't suffer yet because they're just amoeba, falling and falling forever. And eventually they fall together, get much more complex systems. Eventually they put on faces and they turn into people. But it's all about the fall, you know. It's all about gravity and the swerve that the avoidance of suffering puts into that fall, and which slams people together and slams people into one another and slams people around one another and makes us fall in love with one another, because the falling is also a falling in love, isn't it? And a falling out of love. And this whole thing is only meaningful because of the fall. I don't know if it's a fall from grace or not. Maybe the whole thing is graceful. Maybe the whole thing was graceful when it was just a fine film of ashes falling through the universe forever. Or a snow on a windless day. Maybe that was graceful. And now we've fallen out of grace. Since we've started swerving, and the suffering of the world has made us twist on our falls and collide and grab one another desperately, like novice skydivers hanging on to one another and causing one another to crash. Maybe it's that. Maybe we've fallen out of that graceful flight, and now we're falling gracelessly and clumsily down forever towards the future. Anyway, thanks for the title of the video there, Gary. It's